Good afternoon. This is another video looking at Zambian culture, and the theme is cultural deforestation. What do I mean by cultural deforestation? Well, in my previous video on Zambian culture, I was looking at how community outlook is such a beautiful thing that people look at for family here, that they are clearly other-centered, that their first question is not asking about what about me, what about my rights, but rather they look outward to the outsider to welcome them. They also look out to their own families. However, with smartphones here, which are not used as often in the West, as in the West, because here people don't have the power, the electricity needed to use them as much. But nevertheless, people in my generation and below are still using smartphones. And there's a clearer change in culture that the kids are becoming more individualistic and a little less family oriented. I'd say compared to the West, it's still very distinct as a culture, but the older generation here do notice that difference. And it makes me a little bit sad because it feels like globally, and in particular, Western culture is being exported on a global scale and is percolating through Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and Snapchat and YouTube and all of these things. And it's causing a kind of deforestation of the cultural beauty that you have here, since most of the media that you will be getting, the majority of it will be reflecting more of an individualistic outlook on life rather than a uniquely Zambian outlook. And that's not a criticism of social media, that's just the inevitable consequence of introducing one very specific culture to the average media that would be popular on a global scale. And the average media that's popular on a global scale is not Zambian media. And so obviously that has an effect here. And I call it deforestation because, again, as with my previous video, I think that's quite sad. People are very happy here, and I think a lot of that is owing to the culture. It is a Christian culture, and it's mixed with an African emphasis on family, and it makes for a very outward-looking focus where your cousin's cousin's cousin is basically your brother. In fact, I've had people call me, they say, "You are my brother," even though I'm a complete, well, I'd say I'm mostly an outsider to this culture. My parents are Southern African, and so yes, there are resonances that I particularly feel with this culture, but nevertheless, I at least look like an outsider to others, and they welcome me as a brother. And so it would be a shame for that to be lost. And I'm thinking, like, how does a culture which is going through a lot of changes with respect to taking on social media and taking on all of these technologies, how does it maintain what is good, what is beautiful about its culture, and not take on all of the pathologies of Western culture, which most people in social media have some awareness of? It's almost like you have every culture has its own problems and every culture has its own advantages. And it's just really boring if all the cultures across the world get replaced by having the same problems and possibly the same advantages as well. It would be nice to preserve what is unique about this culture. So I don't know. I spoke to my friend who's into IT here, and I said maybe there should be like a Zambian social media platform that promotes Zambian culture, and it would be from the perspective of Zambia identifies itself as a Christian nation, and so it would be from the perspective of that. This also leads into the second part of this video, which is talking about the way equality is viewed in Zambian culture compared to how it's viewed in the West, and the differences that are there. Because I had a conversation with a janitor at the university that I'm working at, the African Christian University, and he was saying the reason Zambian people say things like they don't mind about skin color here, or they welcome outsiders, or whatever it is because they have a view of equality that's based on the image of God, that all humans are made in the image of God. But the way that they see that, it turns them to look outside, and to consider, what is my responsibility to my neighbor? What responsibilities do I have to my family? And it's quite interesting. Another example of this is from a lady who I spoke to at a cafe. And you'll notice I'm speaking to loads of random people. And again, that's because people are so warm here. I just met this lady. She was very lovely. She had sadly been at her friend's funeral earlier this week, her best friend's funeral, but she was very open with me. And it was great to see. She's 60 years old. And one of the things she said was that when her father died, which was much longer ago, but when her father died, someone who the family trusted took the role and responsibility that her father had. And the man who took that role and responsibility was a 50-year-old man, so it was younger than the children in the family, but they still deferred to him as if as having the role of a father. And again, I just thought that was so interesting that there's such a close connection between family here that, I mean, I don't think I'd be willing to do that if a cousin or a more distant relative died, that I would take on the role of that relative to some extent. But there was something really weirdly beautiful about that people come together in this culture in a much more reliable way. And again, it's very outward looking. And again, it's viewing people like, how do I love them as I would want to be loved? Now, I'm not sure I'd want someone to just replace my relatives, but there's something radical about being willing to do that should the family be in desperate need, or should there be a need for someone to fill what was missing after a loved one passes away. And so those are two examples of a kind of how equality and seeing others in the image of God has created an outward-looking, responsibility-oriented view in Zambian culture. Whereas in the West, I think because we're quite individualistic, and because we've lost a sense of why we believe in equality, namely seeing others as made in the image of God, when we talk about human equality, often it's with respect to my rights rather than responsibilities. What is my right? How have I been wronged? How have I been, I don't know, rightly or wrongly, like whether you're correct or incorrect, it's all about how do I defend myself, and what I am due. And it's quite, because it's individualistic, it's almost like it can't but be inwardly focused on whether I'm being treated as equal, rather than whether I'm treating others as equals. The focus is far more on defending my own rights. And I was wondering how to account for that difference because both believe in equality, but one is inward focused, whereas the other is outward focused. And I would argue that from what I've seen here, having lived in the West almost all of my life in Scotland and England, the society there is not happy in the way that it is here, even though both believe in equality. And I think it's because equality here makes you outward looking. And I would say, just from listening to why people are outward looking, it's because they believe they have a God-given responsibility to care for all other humans on the outside. Whereas when you don't view things from the lens of divine responsibility and love, and viewing others as precious and in the image of God, but rather equality is just like a pragmatic basis for defending rights, that can lead you to be more inwardly focused. So I think it doesn't completely owe to merely Christian doctrine. I think it's influenced by Christian doctrine in Zambia, which makes people more outward looking. But there's also obviously an African influence that was already very family oriented, and that might be why it's also outward looking. So yeah, I think it was interesting seeing the relationship between the same belief in equality, and yet one culture views it through a lens of responsibility, one views it through the lens of rights. And how do you account for that difference? It's complex, but I think one of the factors is whether that responsibility is God-given, and forces you to look outward rather than inward. There are so many factors, historical and stuff. People could talk about Protestantism and that kind of thing in the West, for example. Um, and then the last part of this video is more of a theological reflection. And that is because I don't know how to square these cultures. I really don't. I don't know how you take all the advantages, and there are advantages of individualism in the West. If you're prone to protest when your rights are being violated, that can actually cause change, and that can promote justice in many ways, and that can be a good thing. Whereas if you let your own rights be overlooked to a large extent, maybe you won't protest or oppose the government when they're clearly out of line, and so there are advantages there. But then here, obviously in Africa, there are immense advantages, and I'll be honest, I really love it in this culture insofar as it's happier, and the advantages are. You're not really concerned about yourself. You're more concerned about your neighbor, and you do look after yourself. Absolutely, you do. But that's not your first question. Your first question is, how is this affecting my community? How is this affecting my family? And my friend rightly recognized, I think, one of the issues, one of the things that can cause me to be sad, and one of the issues with depression as well, is when you become very inwardly focused, whereas this culture is very outward focused, and that I think accounts for one reason why people are happier here is because their first question is not my rights, my my goals, my desires. How do I realize me and my plan for life, but rather how can I help my family, and so that is a beautiful thing. And I don't know how you square the two. But there are verses in the Bible that say in heaven, the glory of the nations is going to be poured in. And there's something really beautiful about that, because I think of the glory of this nation. I think about the contentment people have here, the happiness they have here, the laughter, the outward focus, the love, the unity. Despite having 70 tribes, there's more unity here, I would say, than there is in the UK, even though everyone speaks largely the same language in the UK, as if you're native to the UK. And so it's just hard to know how you'd preserve both. But God says the glory of all the nations is going to be poured in to the kingdom of heaven. And so I look forward to eternity when all the glory of the contentment and joy and outward focus of this nation, and all the glory of, I guess, Western productivity and standing up for rights and justice and that kind of thing is also poured in. And I think that's what is truly beautiful about diversity. It's not about the superficial optics, which I think we're so concerned about when it comes to diversity, like very, very superficial impressions we have of people. It's like, oh, you have this skin color, therefore you must be that, and it can degrade the rich cultural heritage that someone might have regardless of their skin color, which I think is a significant factor in diversity, that is just part of the glorious vision of what Christians hope for in the future, in the kingdom of heaven. So yeah, bit rambly. Summing it up, I think cultural deforestation is a bad thing. I hope there are ways of mitigating against it. I think that Zambian culture is beautiful because equality somehow, through their Christian perspective, and this is me reporting what Zambians have said to me, through their Christian perspective, it causes them to look outwards rather than merely inwards, which I think is beautiful. And it makes me look forward to the kingdom of heaven, where I don't need to worry about cultural deforestation and all of these things, or indeed the loss of some of the advantages of Western culture, because the glory of all of these things will be there in the kingdom of heaven. And I think that's quite beautiful. Bit of a long one, but I hope you have a good day and hope this was of some help to you. God bless. Bye.